The H. Holmes case reveals the darkest architect in American history. While the 1893 World's Fair promised a future of electric light, Holmes was constructing a labyrinth of shadows just blocks away. He built a hotel rigged with soundproof vaults, hidden gas lines, and greased chutes leading straight to the basement. It was a factory designed for one purpose: to make guests vanish without a trace. He didn't just welcome travelers, he processed them. This is the terrifying true story of the devil in the White City and his castle of horrors. To understand the magnitude of the horror H. Holmes unleashed, we cannot look at his crimes in a vacuum. We must look at the stage upon which he performed. The Chicago of 1893 was not just a city, it was a vibrating, chaotic, industrial beast consuming the American Midwest. It was the fastest growing metropolis on Earth, a place where the smoke from the meatpacking district choked the sky and the noise of the railways never ceased. Yet, rising out of this grime was a miracle: the White City. The world's Columbian Exposition was designed to be a utopia. It was a sprawling campus of neoclassical architecture, painted in blinding white and illuminated by the brand new miracle of electricity. For a few cents, a visitor could step out of the mud of the 19th century and walk into the future. It drew millions of people, 27 million to be exact. They came from the quiet cornfields of Iowa and the small towns of Wisconsin, carrying their life savings and a desperate desire to see the spectacle. But this mass migration created a dangerous phenomenon. For the first time in American history, there was a true ocean of anonymity. In the small towns these people left behind, everyone knew your name. In Chicago, you were nobody. You were just a face in a crowd. If a young woman stopped writing letters home, her family assumed she was too busy finding a job. If a young man vanished, it was assumed he had moved west. This disconnection was the soil in which a predator like Holmes could thrive. He realized before anyone else that in a city of strangers, a life could be extinguished without making a sound. But before the first brick of his castle was laid, the foundation of the monster had already been poured years earlier in the quiet, frost-bitten hills of New Hampshire. The man who walked the streets of Englewood as the charming Dr. Henry Howard Holmes was a fabrication. Beneath the silk tie and the bowler hat lived a creature named Herman Webster Mudgett. Born in 1861 in Gilmanton, Herman was the product of a household where fear was the primary language. His father was a strict disciplinarian who believed the rod was the only way to shape a child's character. Growing up in the shadow of this volatile authority, young Herman learned his first vital lesson: power is the only thing that matters. Psychologists often point to a specific pivotal moment in his childhood as the catalyst for his pathology. As a young boy, he was bullied by older schoolmates. In a cruel attempt to traumatize him, they dragged him into a local doctor's office, forcing him to stand face to face with a hanging human skeleton. They grabbed his small hands and made him touch the cold, dry skull, expecting him to scream. But he didn't scream. In that moment of forced confrontation, the fear evaporated, replaced by a surge of dark fascination. He realized that the dead could not hurt him. They were simply objects, puzzles of bone and wire. This was the moment the off switch for his empathy was flicked. He described it later as a feeling of triumph. He had looked death in the eye and found it mundane. As he grew older, this fascination led him inevitably to the University of Michigan Medical School in 1882. For a budding predator, this was a candy store. The anatomy lab gave him unrestricted access to cadavers. It was here, amidst the smell of formaldehyde, that Herman Mudgett refined his craft. He learned that a human body had a monetary value. While his peers were memorizing the Hippocratic Oath, Mudgett was running scams, stealing cadavers to defraud insurance companies. To him, people were no longer souls. They were inventory. By the time he graduated, the mask was complete. But Herman Mudgett was a name tied to small-town scandals. He needed a new skin. He left his young wife and child behind, shedding his past as easily as a snake sheds its scales. He moved to Chicago and reinvented himself as Dr. H. Holmes. The name sounded distinguished, trustworthy, and American. He had successfully transformed from a socially awkward student into an urban gentleman. The predator had arrived in the jungle, and the chaos of the World's Fair provided him with the perfect cover. On the surface, the massive structure dominating the corner of 63rd and Wallace was a bustling hub of commerce. The ground floor was respectable, filled with the noise of customers buying drugs from the pharmacy or browsing the retail shops. It was the perfect camouflage, a mask of normalcy worn by a monster. But if you were unfortunate enough to be invited up the stairs to the second floor, you left the rational world behind and entered the physical manifestation of a madman's mind. To understand how such a monstrosity could exist in a major American city, you first have to understand how it was built. Holmes knew that if he hired a single architect or a single contractor, the blueprints would raise too many questions. Why do you need a room with no windows? Why do you need a chute that leads directly from a bedroom to the basement? Why are the walls lined with asbestos? So, he acted as his own foreman. He hired crews, let them work for a few weeks on a specific section, and then fired them without pay, claiming their work was shoddy. Then, he would hire a new crew to continue the job, completely ignorant of what had been built before. This created a disjointed, chaotic construction process where only one man held the master key to the puzzle. The result was the second floor, a spatial nightmare designed to disorient, trap, and dominate. Architects usually design a space for flow, for light, for comfort. H. Holmes designed for friction. He designed for panic. The layout was a mortal labyrinth. There were 51 doors on this floor, but they didn't all lead to rooms. Some doors opened to reveal solid brick walls, leaving a fleeing victim staring at a dead end, while footsteps approached from behind. Other doors opened into closets that were actually airtight vaults lined with iron plates. There were staircases that rose steeply, only to hit the ceiling, standing as mocking sculptures of escape. Hallways would narrow suddenly, forcing two people to walk single file or take sharp, angular turns that destroyed any sense of direction. This wasn't accidental bad design. It was psychological warfare. Holmes wanted his victims to feel foolish, confused, and isolated before the physical end began. He wanted to strip away their confidence. By the time a victim realized they were in danger, they were already lost in a maze that had been specifically calibrated to keep them running in circles. But the true horror lay inside the guest rooms. Holmes marketed these as suites for the World's Fair travelers, targeting the young women who were flooding into the city. He offered them a sanctuary, but he placed them in a cell. Many of the rooms were soundproofed with heavy padding. A guest could scream at the top of their lungs, pounding on the door until their knuckles bled, and the person in the room next door would hear nothing but the muffled silence of the city. The most terrifying feature, however, was invisible to the naked eye. Hidden inside the walls was a complex network of pipes. These weren't for water or heating. They were for gas. In a normal building, the gas valves are located in the rooms they serve, allowing the occupant to control the light. In the murder castle, the control valves were located in Holmes's private bedroom. This detail truly reveals the depth of his God complex. He didn't need to physically overpower his victims. He didn't need to risk a struggle or get blood on his suit. He could simply lie in his own bed, listen to the muffled panic through the walls, and with a simple turn of a wrist, extinguish a life. It was clean. It was distant. It was the ultimate exercise of power. This mechanism was the undoing of victims like Julia Smythe and Emmeline Cigrand. These were women who had trusted Holmes, who had perhaps fallen in love with him. They walked into these rooms believing they were safe, only to find the air slowly turning poisonous. Holmes also installed peepholes and sliding panels in the walls. He wanted to watch. He wanted to see the confusion turn to drowsiness, and the drowsiness turn to death. For Holmes, the act of killing was a spectator sport, where he was the only audience member. And once the gas had done its work, the architecture shifted from a prison to a factory. Holmes had resolved the logistical problem of moving a dead body through a busy hotel. He installed large greased chutes, originally disguised as laundry drops, that ran from the upper floors straight down to the basement. Gravity was his accomplice. There was no need to carry a heavy burden down the stairs, risking discovery by a maid or a guest. A body could be stripped, dropped into the chute, and slide silently into the darkness of the cellar in seconds. If the upper floors were designed for confusion, the basement was designed for absolute clarity. When a body arrived at the bottom of the chute, it didn't land in a haphazard pile. It arrived in a workspace that was terrifyingly organized. This wasn't a dungeon in the medieval sense. It was a laboratory. It was the engine room of the factory, where the raw material of human life was processed into its final, profitable form. The police who eventually raided this space were seasoned officers, men who had seen the rough violence of Chicago's streets. But nothing prepared them for what they found in Holmes's cellar. It was a scene where the line between a medical facility and a slaughterhouse had been completely erased. The first thing that hit them was the smell. It wasn't just the scent of decay. It was the sharp, stinging odor of chemicals. Holmes had installed large vats filled with acid and pits filled with quicklime. These weren't for storage. They were for erasure. Holmes understood that a body is evidence. It has a face, fingerprints, and scars that can be traced back to a missing person report. So, his first priority was to strip away identity. He would submerge his victims in these corrosive baths, watching as the chemical reaction dissolved the flesh, leaving behind only the clean, white bone. It was a chemical magic trick, turning a person into a prop. For the bodies that he couldn't strip chemically, he used fire. In one corner of the basement stood a massive kiln. Holmes told his neighbors and creditors that he was experimenting with glass bending, a hobby that required intense heat. But forensic analysis later suggested a far grimmer purpose. The kiln was large enough to hold a human body. It was equipped with high-performance burners capable of generating temperatures that could reduce a corpse to ash in a matter of hours. The glass bending story was a convenient cover for the thick, greasy smoke that would occasionally drift out of the castle's chimney. carrying the scent of burning organic matter over the rooftops of Englewood. But the most chilling artifact in the basement wasn't the acid or the fire. It was the surgical table. Located in the center of the room, surrounded by a collection of gleaming dissecting knives and saws, was a professional-grade operating table. This is where the doctor in H. Holmes truly took over. He wasn't just disposing of garbage, he was harvesting. You see, Holmes was a pragmatist. He hated waste. Simply burning a body was, in his eyes, throwing away money. During his time at medical school, he had learned that there was a thriving black market for human skeletons. Medical schools and research facilities were desperate for anatomical specimens to teach their students, and they didn't ask too many questions about where the bones came from. Holmes realized he could monetize his murders. After stripping the flesh from his victims, often using his own surgical skills to speed up the process, he would carefully articulate the skeletons. He would wire the bones together, creating professional-quality anatomical models. He then sold these skeletons to medical schools across the Midwest for hundreds of dollars. Think about the profound horror of that transaction. A young woman like Minnie Williams comes to Chicago, trusting the man she loves. She disappears into the labyrinth. Weeks later, her skeleton is hanging in a lecture hall, being used to teach aspiring doctors how to heal the sick. Holmes had successfully turned his victims into commodities. He had stripped them of their names, their histories, and their dignity, reducing them to a pile of calcium that could be sold to the highest bidder. The murder castle was a vertical integration of death. The second floor was for acquisition, the chutes were for transport, and the basement was for manufacturing and sales. He had applied the principles of the Industrial Revolution to the act of murder, creating a system so efficient and so cold that it challenges our very understanding of what a human being is capable of. In that cellar, flesh met science, and the result was pure, unadulterated profit. By 1894, the lights of the World's Fair had flickered out, and the smoke had long since cleared from the chimneys of the castle on 63rd Street. But for H. Holmes, the darkness was not an end. It was merely a change of venue. The chaotic energy of Chicago, once his greatest ally, had turned against him. Creditors were banging on the doors. Insurance investigators were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the fires he had set to claim payouts. And the police were circling the perimeter of his carefully constructed life. The predator was being forced to evolve into a fugitive. He hit the road, moving from Texas to St. Louis to Philadelphia, leaving a trail of bad checks and stolen horses in his wake. But he didn't travel alone. Riding shotgun on this desperate tour was Benjamin Pitezel. To understand the gravity of what was about to happen on a quiet street in Philadelphia, you have to understand the tragic architecture of this relationship. Benjamin Pitezel was not just an accomplice, he was Holmes's shadow. He was a carpenter with rough hands, a drinking problem, and a heart that was fiercely, perhaps foolishly, loyal. For years he had been the muscle behind the doctor's mind. He had poured the concrete for the secret vaults. He had installed the gas pipes in the walls. He had seen the women come into the castle and never come out. He knew where the bodies were buried because, in many cases, he had held the shovel. In the criminal underworld, shared guilt usually creates a bond stronger than blood. Pitezel believed that he and Holmes were partners, a duo of outlaws against the world, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He looked at Holmes and saw a genius, a savior who would lead him and his impoverished family to the promised land of wealth and security. But when Holmes looked at Pitezel, he didn't see a friend. He didn't see a father of 5 children. He saw a loose end. He saw a liability that drank too much and talked too loud. And most terrifyingly, he saw a price tag. The plan they hatched in the summer of 1894 was supposed to be their masterpiece, the final score that would allow them to retire. It was a life insurance scam, grand in scale, but simple in execution. The script was one they had rehearsed in hushed whispers in cheap hotel rooms across the Midwest. Pitezel would take out a massive life insurance policy, $10,000, a fortune that could buy a mansion in those days, under the alias B.F. Perry. They would then travel to Philadelphia. There they would procure a cadaver from the black market, a nameless body that roughly matched Pitezel's height and build. They would disfigure the corpse to make identification difficult, stage a violent accident, and claim the payout. Pitezel would then go underground, reunite with his wife Carrie and the children later, and they would vanish into the sunset with the cash. It was a classic faked death scenario. It relied on trust. Pitezel had to trust that Holmes would handle the logistics. Holmes had to trust that Pitezel would stay dead. In late August, Pitezel rented a 2-story brick house at 1316 Callowhill Street in Philadelphia. It was a nondescript building in a working-class neighborhood, a place where people kept their heads down and minded their own business. Pitezel, posing as B.F. Perry, an inventor of patent medicines, set up shop. But the inventory was just a front. The bottles of colored water and the few tools scattered around were props in a play that had only one audience member, the insurance adjuster. For weeks, Pitezel lived in that house alone. He was a man unraveling. The separation from his wife and children gnawed at him. He spent his days drinking cheap whiskey to numb the anxiety, waiting for the telegram from Holmes that would say, "The body is ready." He wrote letters to his wife, Carrie, full of hope and longing. He told her that the plan was in motion, that their troubles were almost over, that soon they would be together again. He sat in the dim light of the Callowhill house, staring at the dust motes dancing in the air, completely unaware that he was writing his own eulogy, because H. Holmes had rewritten the script weeks ago. While Pitezel was dreaming of a new life, Holmes was running the numbers with the cold detachment of an accountant. Procuring a cadaver was risky. It involved negotiating with body snatchers, unreliable, greedy men. It involved transporting a decomposing corpse through the busy streets of Philadelphia without being seen. It involved the risk that the coroner would notice the time of death didn't match the time of the accident. It was messy. It was expensive. And H. Holmes was above all a man of efficiency. He looked at Benjamin Pitezel, a man whose liver was failing, whose face was already worn by years of hard labor and alcohol, and he made a chilling economic decision. Why pay for a fake body when he had a real one right in front of him? Why risk a stranger's corpse when he could use a man who was already practically a ghost? On the morning of Sunday, September 2nd, 1894, the trap was sprung. The street outside was quiet. Church bells were ringing in the distance, a sound of peace that contrasted sharply with the violence about to unfold inside number 1316. Holmes arrived at the house mid-morning. He didn't break in. He didn't need to. He knocked, and Pitezel opened the door. Pitezel was likely hungover, his eyes bleary, his movements slow. He welcomed his partner in, perhaps offering him a seat, asking eagerly if he had found a suitable corpse yet. "Is it done, Henry? Are we ready?" Holmes likely smiled that charming, reassuring smile, the same smile he had used on Julia Smythe and Emmeline Cigrand. He told Pitezel that everything was in place. He might have asked Pitezel to help him move some equipment, or perhaps he suggested they share a drink to toast their success. He maneuvered Pitezel into the second-floor bedroom, the stage he had chosen for the final act. What happened next was not a fight. There was no struggle, no overturned furniture, no desperate punches thrown in self-defense. It was a medical procedure conducted on a living patient. Holmes's weapon of choice was chloroform. It was his signature, clean, scientific, and terrifyingly intimate. It required proximity. You can't shoot a man with chloroform from across the room. You have to be close enough to feel his breath, close enough to look into his eyes. We can reconstruct the scene from the forensic evidence found later. Pitezel was likely seated or lying down, his guard completely down. Holmes, moving with the sudden fluid speed of a viper, produced the bottle. He didn't just dampen a rag. He poured the volatile liquid directly down Pitezel's throat. Imagine the shock of that moment, the burning sensation of the chemical hitting the esophagus, the sudden, overwhelming inability to breathe as the fumes expanded in the lungs. Pitezel would have gasped, his body instinctively fighting for air, but inhaling only the sweet, sickly poison. He would have looked up, through eyes tearing and blurring, at his best friend. He wouldn't have seen anger. He wouldn't have seen hate. He would have seen nothing. He would have seen the blank blue stare of H. Holmes, watching him die with the same mild curiosity a child shows when pulling the wings off a fly. The betrayal was absolute. In those final agonizing seconds, as the darkness closed in from the edges of his vision, Pitezel must have realized the terrible truth. There was no plan. There was no cadaver. There was no future. He was the cadaver. Holmes stood over him, watching the thrashing subside, watching the chest heave one last time, and then fall still. He checked the pulse. He checked the pupils. The carpenter was gone. The friend was erased. Now only the asset remained. Once the heart stopped beating, the architect went to work. The killing was the personal part. The staging was business. Holmes needed to sell the story of an accidental explosion. He moved with the precision of a stage director. He arranged Pitezel's body on the floor, contorting the limbs to suggest he had been thrown back by a blast. He placed Pitezel's arm across his chest in a defensive posture, a final lie frozen in rigor mortis. Then came the special effects. Holmes took a large glass bottle of benzene, a highly flammable solvent used in the patent medicine trade, and smashed it. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence of the room. The liquid pooled around the corpse, soaking into Pitezel's clothes, soaking into the floorboards. The fumes rose up, mixing with the lingering scent of chloroform, creating a cocktail of death. Holmes stepped back. He took a matchbox from his pocket. He struck the match. The flame flared to life, a small yellow eye in the dim room. He tossed it into the pool. The explosion was not a cinematic fireball, but a sudden, violent consumption of oxygen. The benzene ignited with a whoosh that shook the window panes. Fire raced across the floor, hungry and hot. It licked at Pitezel's face, charring the skin, blistering the hands. Holmes watched for a moment to ensure the fire had taken hold. He needed the face to be damaged, just enough to make identification unpleasant for the coroner, but not enough to make it impossible. He needed the world to know this was B.F. Perry. He slipped out of the house, locking the door behind him. He walked out onto Callowhill Street, blending instantly into the Sunday morning stroll. Behind him, smoke began to curl lazily from the second-story window, carrying the scent of burning wood and burning flesh. As he walked away, H. Holmes didn't feel remorse. He didn't feel the weight of the murder he had just committed. He felt a sense of relief. The $10,000 was now just a matter of paperwork. The only person who could testify against him was burning in that room. But as the distance between him and the fire grew, his mind was already turning to the next problem. Pitezel was dead, yes. But the insurance money wouldn't be handed to Holmes. It would be handed to the widow, Carrie Pitezel. And Carrie had 5 children. To get the money, he would need to control her. To control her, he would need to keep her hopeful, confused, and terrified. He couldn't just take the check. He had to orchestrate a new, even more complex web of lies. He realized that the death of Benjamin Pitezel wasn't the end of his work. It was simply the opening move in a much darker game. The fire on Callowhill Street was merely the signal fire. The monster was now untethered. He had killed his brother-in-arms, and having crossed that line, there was nothing left to hold him back. He turned his gaze toward the Pitezel family, who were waiting for a father who would never come home. The betrayal was complete, but the massacre was just beginning. The Pitezel betrayal had been a crime of greed, but what was coming next would be a crime of pure, unadulterated evil. The fire on Callowhill Street had reduced Benjamin Pitezel to ash and memory, but for H. Holmes, the flames were merely a curtain raiser. He had the insurance money, but he also had a loose end that no amount of arson could singe away. The truth. And the truth lived in the memories of Pitezel's widow, Carrie, and her 5 children. To secure his freedom and his fortune, Holmes initiated a plan of such staggering cruelty that it would redefine the very concept of evil in the American consciousness. He didn't just run. He orchestrated a traveling circus of deception, moving the family across state lines, splitting them into groups, and leading them on a death march disguised as a family reunion. This begins the Innocence Trail, the most harrowing chapter of the Holmes saga, and the one that would eventually bring the Pinkerton Detective Agency into the fray. Enter Frank Geyer. He was a veteran detective, a man who had seen the worst of Philadelphia's criminal underbelly. But Geyer was also a man carrying his own private grief. He had recently lost his wife and young daughter in a tragic fire. When he was assigned to track down Holmes and the missing Pitezel children, it wasn't just a job. It was a crusade. He was a father searching for other people's children, following a trail that was already months cold, armed with nothing but a photograph and a deep, burning need for justice. The trail led him first to the realization of Holmes's strategy. The killer had separated the family. He traveled with Alice, 15, Nellie, 11, and little Howard, 8. He sent Carrie Pitezel and the 2 older children on a parallel route, constantly moving them just a day or 2 behind or ahead. It was a masterclass in psychological torture. Holmes told the children that their father was hiding in a new city and they were going to meet him. He told Carrie that the children were with a widow in another town, safe and happy. He controlled the flow of information absolutely. He forced Alice to write letters to her mother, heartbreaking letters filled with the mundane details of a road trip, talking about the weather, about the books she was reading. But he never mailed them. He kept them. He collected their hope in his pocket, knowing that the recipient would never read them, and the authors would never grow up. Detective Geyer's journey retraced these steps, moving from Cincinnati to Indianapolis. In every town, he walked the streets, showing the photograph of the three children to hotel clerks, real estate agents, and neighbors. It was exhaustive, soul-crushing work. He was chasing ghosts. In Indianapolis, the trail grew hot. Geyer found a rental agent who remembered a man matching Holmes's description, dapper, polite, with striking blue eyes, who had rented a small house on the outskirts of town. The agent remembered something else, too. The man had arrived with a boy who looked just like Howard Pitezel. But when the man left, the boy was gone. Geyer went to the house. It was empty, silent. But silence in a Holmes investigation is never truly empty. It is just holding its breath. Geyer began to search the property with a forensic intensity. He focused on the chimney. In the backyard and inside the base of the stove, he found the evidence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He didn't find a body. He found fragments. Sifting through the ash and dirt, Geyer's hands uncovered pieces of bone that had been subjected to intense heat. A piece of a jaw, a few teeth, a chunk of a pelvis that was unmistakably that of a child. The forensic science of the time was still in its infancy compared to today. Fingerprinting was just on the horizon, as we've seen in London. But the anatomy was clear. Holmes hadn't just killed Howard Pitezel. He had obliterated him. He had likely drugged the boy, or perhaps suffocated him, and then, with the same industrial efficiency he used in his Chicago castle, he had shoved the small body into a stove that was far too small, and he had burned him. The image is enough to freeze the blood. An 8-year-old boy, trusting Uncle Harry to take him to his father, ending up as a pile of ash in a rental house in Indiana. Holmes had then simply swept the remains aside and moved on. To him, Howard wasn't a child. He was baggage. He was an expense that had been liquidated. But where were the girls? Alice and Nellie were still alive at this point, traveling with Holmes. Alice, the oldest, was a sweet maternal figure to her younger sister. Nellie had club feet, which made walking difficult and painful. She relied on Alice, and they both relied on Holmes. They were still writing letters to their mother. "It is cold here," Alice wrote. "I wish we could see you." Holmes kept these letters too. Geyer's hunt moved north. He followed the trail of train tickets and hotel registries to Detroit, and finally, across the border into Canada, to Toronto. It was October 1894 when Holmes arrived in Toronto with the two girls. The city was gray, damp, and unwelcoming. Geyer arrived months later in the heat of July 1895, but the chill of the crime scene cut through the summer air. He canvassed the city with a desperation born of the Indianapolis discovery. He knew now what Holmes was capable of. He wasn't looking for survivors anymore. He was looking for a grave. He got a tip from a resident on St. Vincent Street. A man had rented the house at number 16 late the previous year. The neighbor remembered the man because he had borrowed a shovel. He remembered the man because he had asked strange questions about the soil. And he remembered seeing two little girls looking sad and tired entering the house. He never saw them leave. Geyer went to number 16 St. Vincent Street. The house was a modest 2-story brick cottage. He didn't bother with the upstairs. He went straight to the cellar. The basement had a dirt floor. Geyer, exhausted and heartsick, began to probe the earth with a metal rod. The ground in one corner felt soft, disturbed. He grabbed a spade. perhaps the very same type of spade Holmes had borrowed, and began to dig. The smell hit him before the visual did. It was the smell of decomposition that had been sealed away, festering in the damp earth. 3 feet down, his shovel struck wood. It wasn't a coffin. It was a trunk. A standard traveling trunk, the kind used for clothes and keepsakes. Geyer pried the lid open. Inside, arranged with a sickening lack of dignity, were the bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel. The girls were not just dead. They were frozen in a tableau of terror. Nellie, the girl with the club feet, was at the bottom. Alice was packed on top of her. The state of the bodies revealed the gruesome method of their execution. This wasn't a sudden poisoning like their father. This was something far more prolonged. Forensic analysis of the trunk revealed a small hole drilled into the side. This detail reconstructs the final moments of their lives with a clarity that is almost impossible to bear. Picture the scene. Holmes brings the girls down to the cellar. Maybe he tells them it's a game. Maybe he tells them they need to hide because the bad men are coming. He tells them to get into the trunk. Alice, always the protector, maybe helps Nellie in first. They're cramped, knees against chests, holding each other in the dark. Holmes closes the lid. The latch clicks. The girls are now in total darkness. They can hear Holmes moving outside. They probably call out to him. "Uncle Harry? It's dark. Let us out." But Uncle Harry doesn't open the lid. Instead, he takes a rubber hose connected to the gas line of the house. He inserts the end of the tube into the small hole he has drilled in the wood. And then he turns the valve. Inside the trunk, the air begins to change. The sweet, sickly smell of coal gas fills the small space. The girls begin to cough. Panic sets in. They bang on the lid, but the trunk is sturdy and they are small. They're trapped in a wooden box, buried in a dark cellar in a foreign country. And outside, H. Holmes stands there. He doesn't leave. He waits. He listens. This is the deep analysis of the monster. He listened to the coughing turn to gasping. He listened to the frantic scratching of fingernails against the wood. He listened as the voices of the children who had trusted him, who had eaten with him, who loved him, slowly faded into silence. He stood there until there was no sound left at all. Then he didn't even bother to take them out. He didn't bury them in individual graves. He simply left them in the trunk, covered it with dirt, returned the shovel to the neighbor, and walked away. He went back to his hotel, perhaps ate a good dinner, and continued his game with their mother, Carrie, telling her that the girls were fine, that they were waiting for her. When Frank Geyer lifted the body of Alice out of that trunk, he found something that broke him. In her hand, or perhaps pressed against her chest, was a toy, a small wooden doll or a keepsake she had carried on the long journey. It was the only piece of innocence left in a hole filled with depravity. The discovery at St. Vincent Street was the catalyst that finally turned the public's fascination with Holmes into a national fury. Up until this point, he was a swindler, a con man, maybe a killer of women in Chicago, crimes that the Victorian public could distance themselves from with a shudder. But this was the slaughter of the innocent. This was a betrayal of the fundamental contract between adults and children. Geyer's report of the scene is clinical, but the subtext is one of profound horror. He noted the perfect preservation of Nellie's feet, the undeniable proof of identity. He noted the hair, still braided by a mother who was hundreds of miles away, waiting for a letter that would never come. The innocence trail ended in that cellar in Toronto. It proved that H. Holmes was not merely a criminal scientist or a greedy opportunist. He was a black hole. He consumed life without preference. He had looked into the eyes of Alice and Nellie, eyes that looked at him with hope, and he had extinguished them simply because it was the most efficient way to solve a logistical problem. As the bodies were taken away, the city of Toronto and the world struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the act. The American gentleman had revealed his true face. He was the boogeyman, the thing that hides in the cellar, the monster that tells you everything will be all right just before he turns on the gas. And for Frank Geyer, the man who had lost his own child to fire, looking down at the charred remains of Howard and the suffocated bodies of the girls, the hunt was no longer about the law. It was about vengeance. The evidence was gathered. The trial awaited. And the ghost of the White City was finally about to face the judgment of the living. While Detective Geyer was unearthing the tragic remains of the Pitezel children across the Midwest and Canada, the Chicago police were turning their attention back to the source of the rot, the castle at 63rd and Wallace. For years, the building had stood as a fortress of secrets, looming over the Englewood neighborhood like a dark monolith. Neighbors had whispered about the strange smells and the constant turnover of young women, but no one had dared to look too closely. Now, with Holmes in custody and the newspapers screaming about the monster of 63rd Street, the police arrived with sledgehammers and spades, ready to tear the secrets out of the walls. The investigation of the murder castle was not a standard crime scene walkthrough. It was an archaeological dig into hell. The moment the officers stepped through the doors, they realized they were dealing with a mind that operated on a different plane of reality. The upper floors were a chaotic jumble that defied all architectural logic. Seasoned policemen found themselves getting lost in the hallways. They opened doors that revealed solid brick walls. They followed staircases that rose steeply into darkness, only to end abruptly at the ceiling. It was a physical manifestation of madness, designed to disorient and trap anyone who didn't hold the master key. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the true purpose of the design became terrifyingly clear. They found the gas jets in the bedrooms, valves that had no controls inside the room, only outside. They found the heavy iron plates lining the walls of what looked like closets, turning them into airtight vaults. They found the greased chutes hidden behind false panels, dropping straight down into the black void of the cellar. But it was the basement where the forensic truth finally collapsed the last of Holmes's defenses. When the police descended into the cellar, the air was thick with a stench that even the years couldn't fully erase. This was the engine room of the factory. Here, the pretense of the hotel vanished completely. Investigators found large wooden vats, some still stained with corrosive residue. These were the acid baths used to strip the flesh from bone in a matter of hours. They found the mound of quicklime, a chemical accelerant for decomposition. And in the corner, they found the massive kiln, the same kiln Holmes had claimed was for glass bending. Inside the grate, forensic experts found small calcified loops of metal. They were the stays from a woman's corset, the only thing the fire couldn't consume. The basement was a catalog of horrors. Police found a dissection table stained with dark fluids. They found surgical tools that belonged in a hospital, not a hotel basement. And then they began to find the personal effects. A watch belonging to Minnie Williams, a piece of jewelry linked to Emmeline Sigrand, a footprint in the dust that looked small enough to be a woman's. Each item was a silent scream, a tangible proof that the women who had vanished into thin air had actually ended their journey here, on this cold concrete floor. The press descended on the scene, dubbing it the Murder Castle, a name that would stick forever. The Chicago public was horrified. They had walked past this building every day. They had bought drugs from the pharmacy on the ground floor. They had perhaps even spoken to the charming Dr. Holmes. The realization that they had been living next door to an industrial slaughterhouse shattered the city's sense of safety. The excavation continued for weeks, turning up bone fragments, ribs, hips, vertebrae, mixed into the soil and the ash. The exact number of victims in the castle may never be known. Holmes had been too efficient, too thorough, but the forensic truth was undeniable. This was not just a crime scene. It was a mass grave disguised as a monument to modern commerce. The trial of H. Holmes in Philadelphia was the media event of the century. It was the O.J. Simpson trial of the Victorian era. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, reporters, and the morbidly curious, all desperate to catch a glimpse of the devil in the White City. Holmes, true to his nature, treated the proceedings not as a judgment, but as a performance. He fired his lawyers. He represented himself. He stood before the judge in his expensive suits, calm, articulate, and utterly remorseless. He seemed to revel in the attention, treating the courtroom as his final stage. He wept fake tears when it suited him, and then turned cold and arrogant the next moment. He spun wild tales, claiming innocence, then hinting at dark secrets, playing games with the prosecutor until the very end. But the evidence was overwhelming. The body of Benjamin Pitezel, the trunk in Toronto, the charred bones in Indianapolis. It was a trail of blood that led straight to the defendant's chair. The jury didn't need long. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. In the time between his sentencing and his execution, Holmes committed one final act of narcissism. He sold his confession to the Hearst newspapers for $7,500. A small fortune. In it, he claimed to have killed 27 people. "I was born with the devil in me," he famously wrote. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." It was a chilling admission, a mix of truth and fabrication, designed to cement his legacy as the world's greatest monster. On May 7th, 1896, H. Holmes walked to the gallows at Moyamensing Prison. He was 34 years old. He didn't tremble. He didn't beg. He ate a hearty breakfast and walked calmly to the trapdoor. Even at the brink of oblivion, he was playing the role of the gentleman. He asked the executioner to take his time and ensure everything was done correctly. When the trapdoor opened, justice was not swift. The rope didn't snap his neck as intended. Instead, Holmes strangled slowly, twitching and fighting for air for nearly 20 minutes before his heart finally stopped. It was a gruesome end, a slow, agonizing suffocation that mirrored the fate of the Pitezel girls in the trunk and Benjamin Pitezel in the chloroform-filled room. The crowd watched in silence as the architect of death finally met his own design. But the final twist of the Holmes saga didn't happen on the rope. It happened in the ground. Before his death, Holmes had made a bizarre and specific request regarding his burial. This man, who had stripped the flesh from dozens of victims, who had sold skeletons to medical schools, who had treated the human body as nothing more than raw material, was terrified of one thing: grave robbers. He was paranoid that science would do to him what he had done to so many others. He feared that doctors would dig him up to study his brain, to dissect his limbs, to put his skeleton on display. So, he ordered that his coffin be filled with cement. His body was placed in a pine box, which was then filled with wet concrete. This box was placed inside a larger coffin, which was also filled with cement. Finally, the grave itself was reinforced. He ensured that he would be encased in a solid block of stone, untouchable, permanent. It is the ultimate irony of his life. H. Holmes spent his existence building traps to catch others, creating vaults and cells to ensure no one could escape him. In the end, he built one final trap for himself. He lies there today, 10 feet under the soil of Holy Cross Cemetery, trapped forever in a prison of his own making, encased in the very concrete that he used to silence his victims. The castle is gone, erased by fire and time, but the monster remains, preserved in the dark, waiting for a judgment that goes far beyond the laws of man. H. Holmes lies encased in 10 feet of concrete and stone, but the legend he built has proven far harder to bury. In the century since his execution, the story of the murder castle has taken on a life of its own, blurring the line between history and horror fiction. The yellow press of the 1890s, desperate for headlines to match the fading glory of the World's Fair, turned Holmes into a caricature. They reported mechanical torture racks, stretching machines, and a body count that soared into the hundreds. In his paid confession, Holmes himself claimed 27 victims, though he listed several people who were actually still alive. A final con played on the public. The reality, however, is perhaps even more chilling than the tabloid myth. Verified historians can confirm only 9 murders, though the true number is likely higher. But does the count really matter? Whether it was 9 or 90, the nature of the crime remains the same. The horror of H. Holmes wasn't in the quantity, it was in the industry. He didn't kill for passion, he killed for overhead. Today the castle is gone. It was gutted by a mysterious fire shortly after his arrest, a final act of erasure that many suspect was arson committed by neighbors who couldn't stand the sight of it. If you go to the corner of 63rd and Wallace in Englewood today, you won't find a fortress. You'll find a United States post office. People pick up their mail, pay their bills, and walk their dogs over the same ground where Benjamin Pitezel breathed his last, and where little Pearl Smythe vanished into the dark. The physical evidence has been scrubbed away, replaced by the mundane rhythm of modern life. But the ghost of the White City lingers. H. Holmes was not a supernatural entity. He was a man. He was a doctor, a lover, and a neighbor who tipped his hat to you on the street. He represents the terrifying flip side of the American dream. The idea that if you were smart enough, ambitious enough, and ruthless enough, you can turn human beings into currency. We tell a story not to glorify the monster, but to remember the lesson he taught us. The most dangerous traps aren't made of trapdoors, greased chutes, or secret gas lines. They are made of charm, a winning smile, and the cold, blue-eyed gaze of a man who looks at you and sees nothing but a price tag. Thank you for joining me in the White City. Sleep well, and remember to check the locks. I'll see you in the next investigation.